Hello and welcome back to OT, the podcast. We're here to talk about watches, time, and how to spend it. I'm Andy Green.
I'm the one and only Felix Schultz.
Felix, I am very excited. We have some new wrist game going on.
I'm holding it up to the microphone and you won't be able to hear a tick.
Why not?
Because it's not a mechanical watch.
Yes, we are very lucky to be wearing some custom G-Shocks. Felix, what have you landed on?
I think and when we say we, it's not just us. It's our producer. We've got team watches.
Whole crew.
Yep, we've got ourselves a trio of Casios customized by the one and only dial artist.
Yeah, you might remember him from episode 3, I think, of OT.
One of the OG
Chris
guests.
Alexander. Yeah,
he's a lovely guy, and he was so lovely. We've decided to get some watches going down.
Treat ourselves as a bit of a.
So what have you gone for, Andy Green?
So I've gone the green boy with a black bezel and a bit of a camo kind of splatter effect on the dial with lots of sort of greens and shades of green, which I love.
Yep. And Major Tom Media, he's gone for the classic black Casio with the rainbow numbers. But there's a little bit of a personal element there.
Yeah, he's a big football fan, so we incorporated some of his team colours in
the Cats. Is he a Geelong
Cats,
boy?
Yeah, blue and white.
Yeah,
so
classic.
Blue
And
at 12.
I unsurprisingly have gone for the white Casio with the pink and purple strap.
Yeah.
With pink and purple dial details and little bezel prints and the first time I think he's ever done it. That galaxy fleck on the hands.
Yeah, you were pretty demanding with your order in the end.
But you know what? Chris delivered.
Nailed it.
So we're all rocking our Casios now.
Yeah.
And what are we doing today?
So we have a very, very special guest who I'm really excited to get on.
Okay.
Any ideas?
Yep.
I've told you before the show.
Sure.
He's a man by the name of James Cox.
Uh-huh.
Now, if that name sounds familiar, it's because he was the owner of a very, very important vintage Rolex for a couple of decades.
Yeah, right.
Heard of Paul Newman?
PNPN.
PNPN. James Cox was given that watch back in, I think the late 80s by Paul Newman himself. Now, Felix, you asked me earlier what I was doing on October 26, 2017. Well, what were you doing?
I was at work, but I had another browser open where I was refreshing, some feeds from Philips. Was it Philips Auction House?
Yeah.
Yeah. So
selling this watch, which turned out to be the most expensive wristwatch ever sold at the time.
Yep. All in, it was 17.75 million squids. Not squids,
US dollars. Yeah. Plus fees or including fees.
Including. Yep.
What really has been left me curious after that whole thing was what happened to James Cox, the seller. Like, he's gone from this, watch that he wore for his whole life and then auctioned it off. And I just want to know his story, how it changed his life, and get a first-hand account of the watch's journey.
Yeah, and I think it's fascinating. Like, it's such an important bit of watch history and pop culture history, and
it was that watch is the watch that's credited to making vintage Rolex a big thing, but that auction really brought, I think, watches into the mainstream media for maybe the first time.
Yeah, certainly for a while. It's. Can I just come up with a really corny line here for you?
Hit me.
It's a really important moment in time.
Yeah, well, you're a wordsmith.
Thanks.
Well, before we get Mr. James Cox on the phone, we have to take a quick break. Today's episode is brought to you by Swiss Typefaces, who help make the show possible. Have you ever wondered, Felix, what the city of Stockholm, Google Android, and David Beckham's football team Inter Miami have in common with OT the podcast?
I have.
Well, for those who don't know, we all use the same fonts from Swiss Typefaces. When we were building the visual identity of OT, we knew that the right typeface was going to be very, very important because they're everywhere, especially when you're in digital, which, let's be honest, everyone is.
But I find typefaces, they're often overlooked, which is why there's so much stock Comic Sans out there in the world.
Yuck. We knew we wanted something a little bit more cool and a little bit more custom, which is exactly what Swiss Typefaces was able to offer. We ended up with Euclid, which we like for its strong geometry and very graphic feel. It's on our logo, our social media, and it's a big part of the OT brand, though we did nearly go with some of the very cool, very wild and experimental fonts in their lab section.
So if you're building a brand or looking to refresh your existing one, don't overlook the typeface and check out SwissTypefaces.com.
James Cox, great to have you on the show. How you going over there in LA?
I'm doing great, Andy. I really appreciate you reaching out, and excited to have a conversation with you today. Doing pretty well. I'm here. I'm actually up in Santa Cruz, which is north of
Okay.
LA, coastal California, little surf town. Kind of reminds me of like maybe like when I visited Fremantle years ago. I
Ah,
think that's the. It has. I guess that was back in the '80s when I was in Fremantle, and back then, all getting painted up and polished up for the pending America's Cup race that was happening that summer I was there.
oh, very
So
cool.
Santa Cruz has that feel. Just to give the perspective, it's a California version, a little overcrowded, a little too expensive, but the beer is good and the surf is good.
Nice.
What else could you
Yeah,
want? We do see a lot of Santa Cruz surfwear kicking around here. It's very famous
sure.
to see. Well,
Yeah,
James,
that
we've obviously
for
got you on the show to kind of hear a bit about your story. It's probably the most, I think it's the story of the most important watch in the history of watches, and people can correct me if they're wrong. But James, you once owned Paul Newman's Daytona and very famously auctioned it off. I think it was 2017. I'd love to kind of hear your take on sort of that watch and that journey, and maybe if we start, with the story that I'm sure you've told a million times, but how you ended up with that watch.
That's great, Andy. I'll flash back for a moment because it is kind of a beautiful story, and people always find it interesting that I've had such an iconic watch for so many years without knowing how iconic it was. And of course, it didn't necessarily start off that way. So
Hmm.
back in the '80s, in college, I met this super rambunctious hot blonde. I was standing in my parking lot of my school as my first year at university, and this Nissan Stanza car comes in the driveway, and it's a gravel driveway, and then hits the U brake and spins the
Yeah.
car around into a spot. And this hot-headed blonde gets out with a six-pack of beer and marches past me like, "Who are you looking at?" And I was like, "Wow, that girl is hot." And that I was fixated on her. And at the time, it was interesting. That was Paul Newman's daughter, but she did not go by that name in college. She chose a
Ah,
different name to remain anonymous. And clearly, I didn't at the time know who her family was, nor did I care. Being a young
yeah.
college guy, she had a nice car and she always had beer. I was like, okay, that's my girl, and pursued her. And sure enough, we ended up hitting it off and started. We were actually dating before I figured out her family. So that was great because what that did for her, as you can imagine, as a child of a famous person, and Paul Newman, of course, was extremely famous during her childhood.
Mm,
She always described it as life in a fishbowl, where
okay.
everybody's looking in at you. And I'm sure it's not as difficult as actually being Paul Newman, but it's a tough place to be as a child of a famous person. So
Mm.
she did her best to remain anonymous, and that was great because I clearly was after her for other reasons. And we ended up actually dating for 10 years from that summer on.
Wow.
So it was a really great relationship. But the way I came about the watch is, I during one summer I was back visiting her family, and they were in Connecticut. And during the summers, I would just do various trades to save money for college. And they had an old treehouse on their property that had fallen down, and I decided that I would rebuild that as one of my summer projects. And quite an elaborate treehouse. This was a big oak tree hanging over a small river,
Okay.
and it
Oh
was
wow.
10 by 10 with pointed ceiling and shingles and just a gorgeous treehouse. And the Newmans owned a house on each side of this river, and there was a small bridge across it where I was building the treehouse. And in the afternoons of this summer, uh, Paul Newman, who would be at one of the houses and I at the other, we ended up being alone in these houses. Like the whole rest of the family was gone that summer. His wife, Joanne Woodward, who everybody knows, very fantastic actress and
Yeah.
Academy Award winner, wonderful woman. She was gone doing a live theater that summer. His other five daughters were all spread out around the country. It was just Paul and I in these two different houses, and we would meet up in the afternoon. He'd come over and check out my progress on the treehouse, and often have in tow somebody else, whether it's Martin Scorsese or whomever. And as an
Wow.
18-year-old,
That's crazy.
pretty ignorant college boy, I had no idea who these people were. They were all super cool, but
Yes.
I was not a starstruck kid. But it was kind of neat because he'd come over and check out my progress and invite me back for some leftovers. And then this one day he came over, and I honestly don't know to this day. I assume it was premeditated and not maybe that spontaneous. But he came over and he asked me what time it was,
Oh, yep.
and
Goosebumps.
I said, Paul, I said, I don't have the time. And he was trying to wind his watch, which he'd forgotten to wind, and he took it off his wrist and said, well, here, if you wind this thing, it'll keep pretty good time. And he hands me this Rolex. And that was kind of towards the end of the summer, and we had already kind of bonded pretty well. And so imagine this, here I'm 18 years old, my girlfriend's dad, already awkward enough, but he also happens to be Paul Newman, and hands me this thing, and I'm like, wow. I mean, I was smart enough at the time to know that a Rolex was an important timepiece, but how cool is that? He's giving me this watch. And so I wore it the rest of that summer, winding it. He showed me how to wind it at the time.
Mm-hmm.
And then he walked off that night. And that was he didn't make a big deal about it. And I wore it for the next, 20 some odd years, pretty much every day. And I coveted it because primarily it was a gift from this super cool guy. And it wasn't until the 90s at a trade show in Salt Lake City, and I was there for one of my business events, international trade show, and a Japanese businessman who didn't speak very much, barely any English, notices the Rolex on my arm and points to it and says, Paul Newman watch, Paul Newman watch. And I look at him like, how does this guy know that I've got Paul Newman's watch? It just like, what is going on here? And I just the guy walked away, and I just kind of tucked that away in my mind, think, what an unusual thing. And then did a little research and found out, well, indeed, Paul wearing this watch had kind of made this particular watch synonymous with him. But of course, that was the 90s, still not seriously on my radar that this had as much gravity as it did. So again, I kept wearing it for quite a few years. When Paul died in 2008, a couple people had inquired with the family as to where Paul's Rolex had gone, and that led them back to me. And somebody at that time reached out and offered me like $1 million for the watch. And it was at that point I realized the watch had some power. Of course, I declined, and then a few other little weird things happened. I remember I walked by a Rolex dealer in Monterey, California, and they had a couple Paul Newman Daytona watches in the window, and I recognized it. And there's a Rolex guy standing outside smoking a cigarette. He's got his white coat on that says Rolex. And I just pointed to the watch and said, hey, what's retail on some of those watches? And he says, oh, about 70, 150,000. We have a couple other Paul Newmans in the back. And I was like, wow, Paul Newman's. He's calling it the Paul Newman watch. And that was like my other clue. And then as it happened, every year after 2008, I'd get a call from somebody kind of tracking it down. Usually the same gentleman offering me like another $1 million. How about $2 million? Nope. And then I decided to put the watch away in a safe deposit box, realizing it had quite a bit of value. And it pretty much just sat there for quite a while. I think that, losing Paul and helping the family grapple with that, and just, it was a tremendous loss. I'd spent so many years with his family and with him, and he was just a super important person in my life. And I had this connection to him in this watch. But fast forward, I realized this thing's in a safe deposit box, and it was occurring to me how valuable it potentially was. And I just said, if Paul was alive, and I went to him and said, Paul, that watch you gave me, it turns out it's extremely important and extremely valuable. The first thing he would say was, well, kid, what are you going to do? You're not just going to sit on it, are you? And I think he would have supported pulling it back out and doing something and good with it. And so, so that was kind of my thinking at the time. And I checked in with the family, and they kind of agreed with my thinking. And then again, long story longer, calling a few friends of mine in the watch world, got connected with a Rel from Phillips,
Mm-hmm.
who most of your listeners probably know.
Definitely.
And yeah, and that part of the story is kind of fun too. I mean, my friend had been working with Aurel, had a couple of some cool Patek Philippe watches that I think were Eric Clapton's watches that he was discussing with Phillips to bring to auction.
Mhm.
And so my friend asked me, says, "Hey, do you mind if I call my friend Aurel in Switzerland and tell him about your watch?" I'm like, "No, no, no, go ahead." And this is when he and I are both in LA. So I guess he gets on the phone and calls Aurel and says, "I've got, my buddy James here, and he's got the Paul Newman watch." And Aurel, of course, pauses, and he's like, "A Paul Newman watch?" He's like, "No, no, 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 he's got the Paul Newman watch." And there's like a big pause on the phone, and Aurel basically says, like, "Is James going to stick around for a couple of days?" And my buddy puts the phone down and says, "James, you going to stick around for a few days?" Like, "Yeah, I think I'm here for." He's like, "Okay, tell him not to go anywhere." And like pretty much instantly, Aurel arranges to come out to California.
Wow.
Yeah.
And kind of drops everything. And so again, we set up a dinner. Aurel's coming to town. We're gonna go see the watch the next day after the dinner. Aurel flies in, and that's the first time I met him. And he shows up as most nice Swiss guys, all in a nice suit. We're all in California attire. We had a very nice dinner, and I'm wearing the watch. I decided to wear it to dinner the night before, but Aurel doesn't think he's going to see the watch until the next day. Of course, he's like, "Oh, it must be at the office in a safe or something," So we're sitting at dinner with my two good buddies and Aurel. He's pretty much just off the plane, and I just kind of let the appetizers are out. I just kind of let the watch poke out of my sleeve, and just to see if Aurel notices. And he looks over and he literally like almost drops his fork and he goes, "You're wearing it?" And I'm like, "Yeah, I'm wearing it." And then he kind of like pauses and looks at me, and my friend says, "James, a gentleman would let him see the watch." And I'm like, "Okay." So Aurel grabs his plate, slides it out of the way, and looks at me. And I pull the watch off and hand it to him. And sure enough, Aurel whips a loop out of his pocket, and he's just onto the watch. And we really don't hear much from him for the next like 6 minutes. He's like mumbling, he's like, "Yep, yep, oh, the dial, and this." And he's like mumbling and like going over all these little things in his mind. And then he stops and he's like, "I've been thinking about this watch for so many years.
Huh.
And to have it now and to be able to confirm this and that and look at the patina and see that it doesn't look like the watch was ever updated, and it's wonderfully aged." And he's just is the happiest I've seen anybody in years. He's just so happy. And that was just really fun. And then so we arrange, of course, to meet the next day. And that was kind of bittersweet. I mean, I learned a lot more about the watch with Aurel. And the next day, Aurel says, "Hey, may I take this back to Switzerland with me?" And I was like, "Oh gosh, I've got to part with this thing." And
It's getting real.
a couple of the other watches that also were extremely interesting watches. I think, like I said, they were Eric Clapton's Patek Philippe's that were going back with Aurel. And so I'm in my friend's office with Aurel, and we're in this fancy office in LA. And Aurel has kind of assumed he's going to be able to take my watch. And so sure enough, I'm with my friend's blessing, he's like, "This is going to be fine. We trust Aurel." Sure enough, like the armored car literally shows up with these guys that get out bags, and we put my watch in this thing, and it goes by armored car to the airport, and it's all insured. And so this is all new to me, and it felt like a crazy James Bond movie. And then the watch is off in Switzerland, and Aurel is checking it out. And the good news for everyone is that the watch wasn't messed with. I literally put it on my wrist in the 80s, wore it. I mean, I did a lot of construction to get myself through college, and I wore that thing every day, and I beat the heck out of it, and it just continued to perform flawlessly. Never broke it. No new bezels. No new nothing. I mean, a new band at one point because that had rotted. But it just goes to show how well that was such a workhorse.
And can I ask, James, when you sort of met Aurel for the first time, how far out from that was that from the auction?
That was, oh boy, at least a year and a half, if not 2. Yeah.
God.
Yeah, there was a big a big bunch of time there, and there was no commitments made at that evening. It was simply, Arel was happier than he'd ever been in his life, it seemed, and letting it go back to with him and get authenticated and checked out was seemed like a fine thing to do. And
Hmm.
but the folks at Phillips and Arel were just so amazing. There was absolutely zero pressure for me to do anything, and they let me make my decisions in time, and that's when it started to get real for me. And we got together with the team at Phillips, and we said, for me, this is about a lot of things. I mean, there's my new exposure to the watch community was like, wow, if this thing is as important as it is to collectors, and if people out there are that excited, how fun would it be to let them all have a look at it, some of them to wear it, some of them to find out more about this thing. I mean, at this point I'd learned more. Like the watch had its own Wikipedia page, and and people were telling me this is the holy grail of watches. It's the most interesting and significant of the Rolexes. And as I met more and more watch collectors, I'm like, these guys are cool. I mean, they're a wacky bunch. All you guys are a little wacky, but you're
True.
neat. And I mean, I was not a watch collector, but I'm into nice cars and I appreciate well-made things. And I've had many businesses and I've really focused on, design and well-made stuff. I mean, it's right up my wheelhouse. I should have been a watch collector. So part of it was like, wow, we should take this thing on tour. And I didn't know at the time that's what's done typically of vintage watches on auction before they go to auction. Yeah, they go around the world and people get to see. But that was like, wow, we should do this, and we should let as many people get a chance to check out this watch. And so along those lines, when we went on tour with the watch, we made sure that it was as accessible as possible. And Arel and Paul Boutros from Phillips had arranged to have this cool device that the watch could be mounted on out in the open, not behind glass, on a stand. And it was such that if you tried to grab it, it would disappear down into the stand. And you can Google it and see it's a super slick thing. But that was kind of fun too. Like the watch is actually going to be out there for people to get that close to. And of course, there are certain people that reached out to me, and I'm like, the writer Michael Caruso from Wall Street Journal, who was in Europe at the time, and I said, you need to, if you're going to write about this watch, you need to put it on. It's in a vault at Phillips. Go to Geneva, get a bottle of wine and a nice cigar, go down in that vault, and pop the wine, put this thing on your wrist, and have that experience. Because this watch, and this sounds a little funny, but the watch had a vibe to it. And, it sounds touchy feely, but like Paul Newman wore this watch for years, he wore it on movie sets. He wore it racing cars, and he got into racing late in life. And, it was just amazing that he had an ability to get into that, to racing, and to do so well. And it's something that he loved so much because everything else in his life was so I mean, he was famous, yes, but he would say it was about luck, and he would say it's because what if I was born with brown eyes? What if he was born in Hungary? And he had this humility, and I think honestly, the racing to him was the one place he could truly. It was just his actual abilities. I mean, sure, he had good cars, but so did other people. But he was a good racer, and he worked hard at it. He was a shitty racer when he started, apparently. But he was good, and he worked hard at it. And I think that was just such an important part of his career. So this watch was used for the purpose that it was designed back then. I mean, it was literally used for timing and lap keeping. And whenever he raced in those early days, he made sure it was visible on his sleeve. And that's kind of unimaginable now to younger people, to think that you'd use an actual stopwatch. But that's how they did it. And sometimes even he would take the watch off if there wasn't a handy stopwatch, like at Lime Rock, Connecticut. If he's just there on a weekend doing some laps, he would actually take it off and hand it to one of his daughters or somebody to do the timing from the pits. So the watch that I had was super authentic in that way. And it wasn't a trophy watch. And he didn't have, he didn't collect watches. He had this watch because it was a tool. And again, back to the original story,
Mm.
he got the watch from his wife, Joanne Woodward. And it's right about when Paul started racing cars after the movie that they did called Winning. And
Yep.
she lovingly inscribes on the back of this, "Drive carefully, me," and gives him this watch. And we're pretty sure she bought it at Tiffany's in New York City.
That's
And so
right.
at the time, this wasn't an expensive watch. I don't think they were selling well back then. That would have been in the
Definitely not.
70s. Yeah. And so again, it was for him, it was a loving gift. It was inscribed, and it was a tool. And a lot of your listeners know the story more than I about why it became so cool and iconic. Um, but for me, obviously, very personal, very one of the most personal things in the family, and a super good connection with Paul and I. And I really feel that when we decided to take it to auction, it was, the one reason, again, as I said, to share it, to let the story of the watch come out and bring that excitement. But more importantly, was to bring the story of Paul Newman back out. It had been several years since he passed away. And
Mm.
the reason the watch is famous is because the guy was super cool. And he really was that cool. I mean, he was a superstar, but such a humble man and so generous. And, he starts a food company as a joke with salad dressing and realizes that it's going to be super successful and decides to give all the money to charity.
Oh, how good.
And, and that those products sell in Australia as well. I don't know.
Yeah, sure.
I think
Definitely.
they were the
Definitely.
distributor there. Yeah. And a lot of funding at the time went to different groups in Australia. Um, so I mean that's just unprecedented, right? And many businesses through since then have picked up that charm. And Paul used to say, one of my favorite quotes was that, if people knew how good it felt to give their money away, they wouldn't wait till they're dead to do it. And he really lived that way. And that's again his the stuff I learned from Paul was like, this watch cannot stay in a safe deposit box. It's
Mm.
obviously, I don't want to risk wearing it anymore. And let's take that imbibed energy, that history, that magic, let's bring it to the world. Let's celebrate Paul Newman. Let's celebrate the watch. And then if we have a windfall, let's do something super cool. And that's where we are.
Yeah.
So, um, you sort of all touched on the question that I was going to ask just then, James. Was there any, and you've sort of spoken about how you gradually, over the course of years and years, realised that this watch was something special, and after Paul Newman passed away, that you sort of put it away somewhere safe. Was there any point where it started, where you stressed out about it, or you started to feel like it was a burden, or you realize that the weight of your possessions was sort of holding you back, maybe?
Well, that's interesting question. I never felt a burden. I was definitely nervous
Mm,
about it. I think again, you know, Paul was such a father figure to me, and as a young kid, I mean, I met him when I was 18 years old, and felt like
formative.
I, yeah, it was a real formative time, and we had this funny relationship because he was way more available to me than I recognized at the time, and
Mm,
I think I was overly careful to honor his privacy because
mm,
I would watch him in public places and watch how many people wanted something from him. And I think one of the reasons he appreciated me is that, I wasn't starstruck, and I did go out of my way to opt to give him his privacy. But I that's the one thing in life I regret is that he was right there. He was trying to connect with me more, and
mm.
I,
Mm.
overcompensated to give him his privacy and didn't take that opportunity. It's really my only regret. And gestures like handing me the watch was significant. Of course, at the time, you must remember, yeah,
Yeah.
he's giving me something that is super cool, but obviously he doesn't realize the watch is a famous iconic piece at
No,
that point.
Yeah.
Even though I'm sure it had traction, but not on his radar. And he was not a man. He didn't collect things. He didn't keep cars and trophies, and he did not. He really had his priorities straight. He was about family, dignity, honor. Always really thinking. As I look back, he was just a really smart guy, and we did have very tender moments and good connections. But he'd often invite me places, and I declined, thinking that he wasn't a genuine offer. And I think it was one night when he came over to visit me at the treehouse, and he introduced me to somebody as family, and I said, "Well, sort of family." And he came back like 2 days later and said, I didn't mean to offend you by calling you family. And that's the kind of guy he was. Like,
Yeah.
he's a superstar, and he's got this 18-year-old kid who's dating his daughter, and he's sensitive enough to think on that he said something that might have offended me. And how could you be offended with Paul Newman saying your family? And of course I wasn't offended. I just was embarrassed or whatever it was, trying not to. But that's the kind of guy he was. Like, 2 days later, to remember that and make an effort to say something to me, just so amazingly aware, but not of the trappings. And so again, back to your question about things, I think that's the stuff I learned from him, is not to have these possessions and be weighted down. Like, try and keep your eye on the prize, which is doing good and communicating and valuing family and friendship, those sort of things. And also, I was just broke my whole life, so it's not like I was able to accumulate things. But again, I felt like this wasn't, in some ways it wasn't my watch. It was really like I was a steward to kind of take care of this watch, and feeling that if other family members had it, they might not have treated it the same way. And at the time, I did feel like family. I mean, I spent 10 years with that family, and I'm still connected with them. I mean, I broke up with Nell, his daughter, but we remained steady friends. And to this day, I mean, I saw her last Friday. I'm seeing her this Friday. Her husband is, I was the photographer at their wedding. I'm super tight. And I run her, I'm the treasurer of her private foundation, which, fast forward, is now the vehicle for which we're using to take those funds from the sale and carry this magic and momentum forward. So that's a very long answer to your question.
A great answer.
The burden was more nervousness about, am I
Yeah.
doing the right thing, and am I going to honor Paul with this? And people say, oh, you must felt like you won the lottery or something. It's like, no, I think we did a very smart and careful dance. We were very patient, and luckily I had the very good guidance of Paul Boutros and Aurel Box from and their team from Philips. These are good people. They're very caring. They became quick friends, and I trusted them, and they trusted me, and it was just like they understood what was important, and they would make the effort. They helped me do things that were unnecessary to probably have a good auction. For example, I said, when we show the watch, it needs to be emotional. It needs to be about Paul. And let's, and I think this was one of even Aurel's idea, let's get a race car. Let's get one of Paul's race cars and have it next to the watch, because that is emotional. And we did things like that. We found his race cars, and we'd have them shipped from California to New York, and they'd literally pull the glass off the walls of the Philips auction house and crane the damn car in, so that you'd walk into this room and you'd see the car and the racing suit and the watch and just the emotion of it. And then we, Nell and I, we'd send letters to Paul's friends like Mario Andretti, who luckily came out for the night, and we had this beautiful night before the auction where we got to tell stories about Paul, and to a full house of several hundred people. And as I say, this was, for me personally, it was much more about the story and the watch being a symbol, and reminding everybody, like, hey, the reason this watch is cool, sure, it's a handsome watch, and it delivered on its promise. But it's cool because Paul Newman made it cool. And you can say, Jacques Cousteau wore watches that have purpose and function in history, but for some reason, this dude just stood out, and that's what was important to me. And once I knew we were doing that, I felt good about it. And then the fate was in the hands of time and history. Um,
Yeah.
and we brought, Mario Andretti got up there on the stage, and another kind of fun, cool story is that the night we're going to go talk about Paul, um, I go to my closet and I pull out a tuxedo that Paul had given me.
Oh, no
And
way.
actually, correctly, Joanne had given it to me. His wife Joanne gave it to me because Paul was hoping to never wear tuxedos ever again at the time. And it's the same tuxedo he wore. I think he wore it. He wore it at the Oscars when he got his Oscar with Tom Cruise. And I Googled that and I could see the tuxedo there. Like, yep, that's the same tuxedo. And then apparently he wore it at one other night because I put it on. It fits me perfectly. Luckily, I fit all his clothes perfectly except his shoes. So I have some good hand-me-downs. So I decided I'm going to wear his tuxedo the night before the auction, and I'm going to wear it the night I'm going to talk about Paul. And I didn't mention this that night because it seemed creepy, but I reach in the pocket of the tuxedo and I pull out a theater stub from a theater in New York. And this again sounds, I mean, I'll send you a photo of it because it's almost unbelievable. I pull this ticket stub out, and it's the name of the play is called Reckoning the Estate. And it's got Paul Newman's name on it. It was a comped ticket, and it was a couple, like, I can't remember how many years before. It's the same date, like 6 or 7 years before. I mean, you just couldn't make this shit up. It's the same night in New York City. It's called Reckoning the Estate. And I put that thing, it's still in the tuxedo up in my closet right now because I put it back in that pocket. And I showed it to his daughter Nell, and she like looked at me like, that is the weirdest damn thing. But I don't think I showed it to you that night. It just seemed too strange to be true, right? Isn't it spooky? And so anyway, so that night was gorgeous, and it was pretty scripted. And then all of a sudden I just got motivated and I stood up and kind of broke script. I mean, well, I'm not joking that it was scripted, but it felt kind of like an old newscast thing. And I just got up and looked at everybody out there and said similar things to what I'm saying right now. Like, we're here because Paul Newman was super cool, and let's honor him. And I think I did mention that I was wearing his tuxedo, and that was kind of corny but cute. But it was just gorgeous. It was just a gorgeous, gorgeous thing.
Fantastic. It's just an incredible tale.
Yeah, like I say, man, make a longer story longer.
No. I mean, this is a big part of the reason we wanted to get you on, was because I don't think anyone sort of really heard, outside of that evening, your account of ownership told by you in this sort of medium. But I guess what happened afterwards was the massive auction result, and certainly I remember where I was. It was sort of, for the watch world. Where were you when the Paul Newman was sold? And I remember, obviously, it was about midday here. I was in the afternoon. It was in the office at work, and kind of everyone that knew I was into watches was like, "Oh, have you heard about this watch? Have you heard about this watch?" But what I'd love to hear kind of your take on what you were expecting. And obviously, it was marketed for a very long time. But what were you sort of expecting it to go for? You'd had those $1 million plus offers, but for it to sort of hammer, I think, it was $15.5 million US with buyer's fees. It was the most expensive wristwatch ever sold until I think last year. But kind of, what were you expecting, and then what happened once that hammer kind of fell and it was sold?
Well, I think my expectations, I mean, it was hard to guess, and I kind of thought it might hit 5-6 million, maybe. That seemed like a reasonable amount. And of course, the great friends at Philips were very wise and to never tell me what they thought, despite we becoming very close friends. We just really didn't know. And we didn't, the main thing at that point was we didn't want to embarrass ourselves. I wanted to make a good show of it for everybody who had worked so hard. And I think that was my first relief. It wasn't so much like, oh my goodness, we've made a lot of money. It was looking around at the Philips people and go, wow, we worked really hard, and you guys should all be very, very proud. And we had a big celebration that night. And because people, all those folks, so many folks work so hard at this. And so the joy of that, of like, yes, we were correct that this was as amazing a thing, and the world has spoken, and indeed it's amazing. So, and then the next day, we partied hard that night. I think I took everybody, the whole Phillips crew out, find a Thursday night in New York City, find a bar at midnight that would take, 20 people from Switzerland that want to drink champagne. And so we had a nice celebration. And the next day, I left my hotel and I walked from down. I think I walked 70 blocks to pay a visit to Joanne Woodward, who
Hmm.
was in her apartment up in Upper East Side in Manhattan, and she did not attend the auction. She is frail and fighting Alzheimer's and having
Hmm.
some issues, but I felt like I needed to go just see her. So it took a long time to walk, and I walked in my terribly uncomfortable shoes, that pretty much the same outfit from the night before.
Hmm.
A little hungover from champagne, and also with this incredible buzz of like, oh my God, we just had this amazing auction. It was all very surreal. So I just took my time, walked through Central Park, walked through the city blocks, and went and sat with Joanne and told her what had happened, and just sat with her and shared the beautiful story and recounted. And of course,
Wow.
she was not able to really respond, but she's such a beautiful woman, and she sat there and she smiled, and it was just a beautiful time to be with her, and felt so good to me to you know, she was the most important person in the world to Paul Newman. They
Mm.
had such a beautiful marriage, and um, to go be with her that soon after this event and just tell her how I felt and express that, because this gift was from her to Paul.
Yeah.
So kind of her, unwillingly perhaps, to participate in this. Um, it was just a beautiful day for me. And, again, as I say, I felt like a steward of this thing. It wasn't like, oh, cool, we hit the jackpot. It was, oh, cool, we did a great job. And now we have some resources to honor the values that Paul embodied, that again made the watch so awesome. So big day. It was a big
Yeah.
day for me.
Very big day. That's just
Mm.
it's incredible, isn't it? I think it's an amazing story to kind of to hear, and you can lengthen it, you can simplify it, but it's I think, and Felix might agree, but it's sort of one of those magical stories that kind of certainly keeps me interested in the whole watch kind of world.
It's funny. I agree. It's in one ways it's all sort of very surreal and unimaginable for most people, but on the other hand, it's relatable. Like it's not your in-laws giving you a watch and wearing it, and those are relatable things that lots of people have can tie their own experience to. But the magic factor is that you happen to be the 18-year-old that was dating Paul Newman's daughter, and everything that's happened since. It's really quite a special story to hear. So thank you for sharing that. I had another quick question, James. Do you miss the watch at all?
Yes, I do. And I'm actually I have a copy of Houdinki in front of me, and I've got it
Mhm.
open to the watch right now. And I
Mhm.
look at it, and it does bring up some emotion. I do miss it. Just another thing on that earlier point, that I think
Yep.
when people hear this and they say, "Oh, how lucky you did," I was involved in a neat family and they passed this heirloom along. But all of us in the watch world um, have the opportunity to choose a watch, and if it's not already special, make it special and pass it on to family and people we love. And I think that watches have that factor, and maybe my story can help make it more so. I mean, since then I've met people and I've said, is your daughter into that watch? And they'll be like, well, yeah, she's got her eye on it. It's kind of cool. It's like, well, go put something sweet on the back of it for her. Buy her another back if you need to, in case she wants to take it off. But I think that, this is accessible. And again, that's what it is. Paul Newman's famous, but the way he rolled through life, we can all emulate. And you don't have to be famous to be generous, and you don't have to be famous to be honorable. And we can all jump right in this. And those of us that have cool watches can do cool things with them. And it's at a different scale, perhaps. But I just think that the watches symbolically and the size of them, the fun, they're just the perfect thing for this type of behavior, and and since then I've tried to encourage more philanthropy in the watch world. I kind of naively was hoping that Rolex would get all excited about this, and again, this is before I kind of learned more about how the vintage world is so different than the more modern watches and that sort of thing. And this is my naivety about the whole industry. But I'm like, we need to, let's get some other watches and let's put them on some cool people, and let's get those people doing cool things, and then let's auction them off and put the money back in, and let's rinse and repeat. I mean, how many people might think it's fun to have a watch that Leonardo DiCaprio wore for a year, and he did some cool shit with it? And I'm like, great, I'll go fund a cool project to work on, some climate issue in the north of Australia, and we'll get some cool people to get involved, and then we'll auction those watches off and play it forward. And that idea hasn't quite taken shape, but it's not too late.
It's not too late, and you haven't wasted those funds. You've been putting them to work. So obviously the auction was massive and netted a huge amount of money. And I know that the intention was to sort of give some money to the Newman's Foundation, but also you started your own. I guess it's a charitable organization as well. My friend James, what sort of work have you been doing there? How have you put this all to work, and what's the mission?
Yeah, well, the mission is largely centered around climate related issues and organic agriculture. And, I just joke, I'm just trying to save the world. It's not too big an effort, but I've been involved in various philanthropic efforts through the Newman family. As Paul's salad dressing company, he each year would have a certain amount of money that he would let his daughters allocate to various charities of their choice. And Nell and I were, at the time, we were pretty serious environmental, crazy tree huggers back in the day. And so we would all find different environmental things. And since then, we've tempered a lot, and I'm much more pragmatic and much more about. I'm a business guy, and I'm about finding good solutions that are practical. And so what I'm doing with the funds, we're basically, we're spending it down over many years. It's not like people go, you're giving it to charity, you write one big check. It's like, no, I mean, you could do that, but it's way more fun to find many small charities. And I'm a marketing guy. I love business and marketing and finding good messaging. So what's fun is to find a small cause that I believe in and fund it, but also help provide support and marketing and messaging. So one example I love is in Iceland. And I had been going to Iceland to mountain bike and done several, multi-day trips of trail running and mountain biking in the highlands of Iceland, and just fell in love with that, the people and the countryside. And on one trip, I met, he's a famous heart surgeon in Iceland, who's also a very environmental activist, a mountain climber, real outdoorsman. And he and I are on a climb together in the west of Iceland. And he's pointing to this area in the West Fjords. He's like, there's a big mining project and 3 dams proposed in this area. And it's the largest open space in Europe currently. And it's really not a great fate for this area. And I looked at him, I said, well, we should change that then if it's not good. He's like, well, that'd be great. And he already had a lot of momentum with trying to bring awareness to this area. And I said, well, let me help you. I think this is a good project. And that's an example where um, I was able to go in and use good business sense, good marketing sense, and help organize a small group of people that had an honorable cause. And unlike the old days where I might say, yeah, dams are no good and mines are no
Hmm.
good, today is more like, hey, I love aluminum. Like, let's mine aluminum, but let's do it responsibly and let's do it where it should be done and not necessarily in the last open space in a fjord
Mm.
in Iceland. That just didn't make sense. And so, can we go pencil this out? Can we hire some economists to look at the impact and look at alternatives? And sure enough, with a little bit of funding, we're able to demonstrate just with really objective economics that there's a better fate, that this is actually not a great future for this area.
Mm.
And but not coming in and injecting our ideas, but more offering this and getting the community involved. And sure enough, we've been working at this for a couple of years, bringing in people to map the region, talking to the locals that want the dam, and finding out,
Hmm.
what some farm owner like, why would you want this? And turns out, well, he says the crane they use down at the dock doesn't work anymore, and they need it for hauling fish. And if the dam is built, they're going to have money for the crane. And I'm like, oh, well, why don't we just fix your crane? And that was one of the cute stories. I talked to some local guys. I'm like, what do you guys need to fix this crane? And he's like, well, we need like a new electric motor. I'm like, where do you get it? He's like, Amazon, like everything else. And I'm like, what's that going to cost? He's like, about 4 grand. I'm like, oh, well, we'll give you 4 grand and you buy the crane and get the motor, fix the crane. And now you don't need a multi-billion-dollar dam to get your crane. And it's just kind of interesting that so many things, it's like tradition unimpeded by progress, way. And
Hmm.
having some resources to go in and try and unravel these situations and go, maybe the dams were the best fate for the west of Iceland. I didn't think so. And over, a couple of years of studying it and hiring cool people to help, we've demonstrated that, hey, this isn't a great fate. In fact, we've got better ideas. And sure enough, with the help of oil prices crashing and the
Mm.
work we've done and helping landowners protect their land, it's pretty likely this project will not go forward. And in its place, we're probably going to help a lot of farmers and fishermen, and it's just cool. So that's one example.
Yeah.
Other things that kind of tie back more to the watch world, kind of indirectly, is Celine Cousteau, Jacques Cousteau's
Mm.
granddaughter, has been involved in
Yeah.
indigenous work, filming in South America and retracing her granddaddy's footsteps. She and I got connected, and some of this money has helped with some of those documentaries. And we've also
Incredible.
talked about her granddad's Rolexes and things like that.
Compared
So
notes.
Cool.
the money, yeah. So the money is going to projects that I have my fingers in everything, and that's really exciting. Um, because again, I'm bringing a really practical business side to solving problems in the environment, because I am one that believes that there's tons of practical ways to get ourselves out of this climate mess. And it's not a this or that. It's like we
Hmm.
can honor the change, but we need to do this, and we need to make good choices. So that's what I'm doing. And I
Yeah.
have a website called myfriendjames.com, which started as a joke, because people will be like, hey, my friend James is
Yeah.
doing all this cool shit and he's doing this. I'm like, oh,
Cute.
so let's just call it My Friend James. And the little logo I came up with actually has some the original Rolex dials in it. So it's kind of my slogan for the whole thing was "Watch this," which
Yep.
is kind of cute too. Like, watch this. I'm gonna go do some cool shit, save the world.
Yeah. We'll link that up in our show notes as well. And I remember when you launched the website, I think I sent it to Felix. I said, I remember the guy who sold the Newman Daytona. He set up this website, and I don't think anyone's noticed, but the logo is a pair of watch hands and a dial. And yeah, I think something's happening here. But yeah, look, we'll link that up. That's amazing. It's obvious that you're really passionate about this work, and I've spent a little bit of time on the website, and I'll spend some more looking through at all the great projects. And encourage everyone to kind of subscribe and follow you guys as well to kind of keep up to date. But look, James, I don't think all of the money has gone to charity. I think you've replaced the watch, and I saw this recently. You've replaced it. You've replaced it this year, I think you said, but you obviously sold this treasured timepiece. What did you wear to tide yourself over until replacing it?
Well, actually, I was fortunate enough to have access to another Paul Newman watch, but not a famous one. This one was, I believe, given to Paul by Rolex at some function, and
Uh-huh.
it was a GMT, and I had that on my wrist for a couple of years, and it was lovely, great daily, good working watch, but it wasn't mine, and it didn't quite have the feel I wanted. And at the time, I thought, well, what am I going to get? Well, I want to get another Rolex because I'm loyal to the brand
Hmm.
in some ways, and so I just thought I'd get a new Daytona. And I couldn't get another vintage because, of course, nothing could replace what I had, and I'd be sad, I think, looking at any other
Mm, yeah,
vintage Daytona on my wrist. But I thought, if I get a new one, I can start it
Easy.
over, easy. I'll grave something back. I had a hard time deciding whether I wanted a black or a white, but I just wanted a steel Daytona. I didn't want a fancy one. And I just couldn't find one. I wanted to buy it retail through a nice shop and couldn't
yeah,
find one. I was in an airport, I think might have been in Zurich, and they had a platinum Daytona for
Okay.
some ridiculously high amount of money. And even I wasn't going to spend that much on a watch. And it was also heavy. And
Yeah.
I was
mm,
like, I don't want something that fancy on my watch, on my wrist.
Yeah.
And so I just kept waiting, and it was a couple years, and I had various people from actually Rolex and other people said, "Oh, we'll get you one. I'm sure you should have one." Blah blah blah. But despite being willing to buy one at a drop of notice, I never had access to one, and so but then I started thinking, well, maybe that's not what I really need, and so back to Iceland actually, and this
Okay.
gentleman, this famous heart surgeon named Tomas, and he and I are on a climb. We're in the north of Iceland, and this was a big deal. We drove all day to go to this one climb that's meant there were about 17 people from Iceland, and then I was on it. And most of those people had never been to this mountain and climbed it. And we had a beautiful day. And during the climb, I'm talking to this guy, Tomas, who I just recently met. And he had a Rolex on. He has the
Hmm.
I think it's called, and I have to pardon me for not being such a study, but he had the Kermit, the GMT Kermit. Is
yep.
that it? The green,
Yeah. Yeah.
green.
Submariner, Kermit, I think.
Submariner.
I'm
Yeah.
sorry, Submariner, and he's wearing that on the climb, and I mentioned the watch story to him, and we start talking about watches, and it turns out he's good friends with Ed Viesters,
Hmm.
who had just visited him a week or so before in Iceland, and I'm like, Ed Viesters, I know Ed Viesters also. I worked with Ed Viesters back when I worked at the North Face back
Wow.
in the
Mm,
early 80s. And he mentioned Ed Viesters because of the Rolex connection and because we were both climbing. So at that point, I got this idea, and we for the rest of that climb, Tomas and I start talking about the metaphors in climbing and glaciers and expeditions and time. And we're having and he's a famous heart surgeon and really intellectual, but also very grounded and outdoor guy and great skier, mountain climber. And obviously, Ed Viesters, most of your listeners may know that name as, one
Hmm.
of the most accomplished mountain climbers in the world, summited all the highest summits without supplemental oxygen. And,
Yeah. All
and I knew
14, I
him in
think.
the early days. Yeah, he had just been sponsored by Mountain Hardware, actually. And I was doing work with Mountain Hardware, and I traveled with Ed when he was doing speaking engagements, and just such a humble man. So Tomas and I, there we are in Iceland climbing, discussing our mutual friend Ed and what a lovely human he is, talking
Hmm.
about Rolexes, and then talking about the metaphor of time and glaciers. Actually, was one of the discussions because climate change and the issues around it. I mean, we as a society's known about this for 30, 40 years and is pretty much ignoring it.
Mm.
And Iceland had just had its a famous glacier had just finally disappeared. It
mm.
was the first glacier to officially go, and Iceland acknowledged that this glacier was gone. And they put up a eulogy by where the glacier was.
Oh,
And
wow.
so we're discussing all these things and saying, this is intense. But um, but that's really like, how we measure time, and that we're kind of forcing the world to operate on human time when the
Yeah.
scales are quite different. And these it took how many 50, 100 millions and millions, hundreds of millions of years for all this energy to get kind of stuck in the planet. And just within a very short period of time, very resourcefully, mind you, we've pulled all this energy out and we've turned it into stuff and popped it up in the air. And it's such a fast transition that, of course, there's an effect.
Mm.
And to deny this effect is just simply selfish. It's like, I enjoy a good drive in my Porsche like the next guy. And it's
Yep.
fascinating. But when you really think about it, I mean, metaphorically, but also just basic physics, the amount of time it took to make that energy that just I burn in that car in 30 seconds, the
Yeah.
concept of time, it's a uniquely different proposition.
Mm.
So let's just acknowledge that's true and say that it's
Yep.
amazing. And let's make some different choices going forward. And so we started thinking about this practically, and we started thinking about my friend James. We started thinking about my
Yep.
watch. And then I started talking to Tomas, like, Ed Viesturs told me a long time ago that, like, in an expedition, when you're climbing a mountain, the most important thing is getting down the mountain. And those climbers who forget that make mistakes and summit when they shouldn't and often don't return home. And Ed was fantastic and level minded at knowing when to turn around. And he made many attempts on many of the world's biggest mountains, but didn't summit. Turned around within sight of the summit, saying, nope, not today. Come back another day. And that patience and intelligence is what allowed him to be so successful. And just like Paul Newman, Ed Viesturs will admit honestly that in the early days of climbing, his Rolex Explorer actually was used to help him. And
Wow.
there were times when he really used it in the tent, and he trusted that piece. And I made that analogy, like, wow, that's cool, because many of us just think they're ornamental things. Like, who the hell really uses these watches?
Status. Yeah.
But at least and Ed Viesturs, you'd think he'd be wearing a fancy Sunto Navigator, blah 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 watch, and he doesn't. And part of that's tradition and respect. But it's also just like he got his start doing it. And if Paul Newman was alive today, he'd still be wearing an analog watch.
Yeah.
I mean, it's just because there's a point in time where you go, this is actually enough and it's cool. And it reminds those of us to kind of slow down and wind the damn thing. And, of course, Ed's not winding his and I'm not winding mine. But the point is that this is a good meditative time out. So anyway, back to Iceland. There we are talking about this. And I'm like, this all this work I'm doing to try and get people to understand climate in a way, you could say, like, we as a people have kind of summited the mountain of carbon, and we've had our party and we've blown all this oil, and it's time to get safely down the mountain if we just admit that that's what has to happen now. And we need poets, and we need mountaineers, and we need expedition leaders, and we need scientists. We have to come together to solve these problems, and we can do it and do it with joy and do it with productivity and help our economies. This can be a fantastic challenge for humanity if we treat it that way. And so at that moment, I'm thinking, shit, Ed Viesturs wears an Explorer, and this is an expedition that I'm trying to do. And maybe that's my watch. And I got off the mountain and I reached out to Ed Viesturs and said, hey, Ed, what a coincidence. I was just climbing with Tomas. We're talking about you, talking about your Rolex. And I just started thinking this might be my watch. And wouldn't you know it, I called this jeweler in Vegas who I've been asking about the Daytonas. And this is and she said she was one of the jewelers that said, we get a lot of Rolexes. I'm going to call you. We're going to get you a Daytona. So I called her up and said, I think I want an Explorer. She's like, oh my God, we got an Explorer 2 in white dial today.
Perfect.
And I'm like, goosebumps. I want it. Can you hold it for me? And she said, sure. And I said, okay, I'll be down there. I literally went down the day after. And that was like 2 days later, I flew to Vegas and I bought the watch. And they're in her studio, and Rolex had just done a little promotion on the Explorer 2. So they had the Rolex magazine there. There was a feature on that, and Ed Viesters is in it. And there I am doing what I do, telling my stories to her and her staff. Like, oh my God, Ed Viesters, the Rolex Explorer. Like, this is my watch. I found it. The hell with the Daytona. and um, so then, of course, I followed up with Ed Viesters, and I'm telling him how I want him to go back to Iceland with me. And I want to build some momentum around this story. And the Explorer the Explorer is the right watch in so many reasons. One, it's steel, it's simple, it's understated. I have a feeling, I'm going to wear this thing, I'm going to beat the hell out of it, and it's still going to be doing what it did, just like my Daytona.
That's what it's
And
made for.
yeah, it's the right watch. And, there were times where I felt like, okay, I can't get my Daytona. I'm going to go get an Omega. I'm going to find something nice Omega. I'm going to sit there flipping the bird with my Omega and send it to Rolex. Like, sorry, giving up on you guys. But I feel good about it. I mean, I feel good about having a Rolex. And I think that's just such a awesome watch. And I pretty much feel like that's all I need.
It's a great feeling. I think we're all wondering, have you had the back engraved?
Not yet. And that I'll have to call you back. I've got some ideas, but I don't want to share them yet.
I bet you did.
Yeah, I've got some ideas. And I think, and we have some plans. We're doing some work in Iceland, and we're going to get Ed there. And this I think is good for the watch community. I mean, I think that there's so many cool people in the watch community that love these watches, and the watches have so many stories, and of course they're told in various ways. But I think this idea of charity and playing it forward is something that we can do more of, and we can have a lot of fun.
Agreed.
And yeah, and that's kind of what I'd like to continue. But for now, this one's mine, and it's nice to have something that I can just wear. And and like I said, Ed Viesters embodies a lot of those principles that I saw in Newman, the humility and the accomplishments he's made, and making good choices. And I think he is completely game to engage a little bit more in some of the climate work. And he may pull Rolex in a bit because he's still their poster boy. But again, that other point I think that's interesting, that again, these are, my watch was used authentically, and Ed still uses his. And these aren't, it's not marketing fluff. And some things are. I think that at least in this case, it's very authentic. And that's what Celine Cousteau would say about her granddad too. That back when she was a little girl diving with him and working. I mean, these, especially then, these were very important life and death tools for people. And those of us that enjoy them just as collectibles, I think they're more of a symbolic reminder of simplicity and honoring time in that way.
Yeah, amazing. And I think that, this has been a incredible chat for Felix and I to be on. Hearing that whole story, and it makes you realize that, this watch lasted 30, 40, 50 years, and buying well-made things and quality products does feed into that sustainability side of things as well, because it's sort of by less but high quality. And I think this story perfectly represents that. The fact that this quality thing has then gone on to help you do all this amazing work, which again will kind of link up for everyone, is also really, really special. And even just the kind of the thread that runs through this, which is the connections and the people that you've met and then that have gone on to do other things and meet other people, and how it's sort of brought everyone together, and that sort of community element is really, really cool. It's just sort of made me thinking, well, I'm kind of hearing about, you've bounced to this person and then met that person, and you're kind of mentioning, Paul Boutros and people that we actually know as well. And it just kind of is this lovely reminder that, we can do great things and kind of play our part, and also just that, this hobby can have a bit of purpose. So, James, this has been a incredible chat, and I just, I think Felix will probably jump in as well, and just sort of thank you for sharing your incredible story with us, and generously kind of giving an hour of your precious time.
Oh, I'm so honored. Thank you.
I'd just add, James, that this has been the dream interview, really. I mean, we don't have to say anything because everything you say is just it's just great. I mean, it's even the stuff that you probably don't think really is the meat of the story. It's just it's a real treat to sort of get these insights about something that for our little part of the world is hugely significant. So thank you for taking the time to share.
And you know what I've just realized is that so Julie was there at the auction, Julie Crowless, and she was there kind of finishing off the her illustration of the Newman, and she did I think 12 prints or 2 sizes and 12 prints. I have one of those prints, and it's like I've just been triggered that was because of this. And I was so obsessed with that moment that I bought one of her prints, and you know we've kind of been good friends since, and Felix as well knows Julie quite well. But it's just it's crazy when you
That's what watchers can do.
Crazy small world.
Yeah, it's super fun, and I've wanted one of her prints, and I'm sure I'll make that happen at one point. She does such great work. But yeah, I really appreciate it, Felix and Andy. It is. I haven't sat there and just kind of bantered on and told the story in a long time. I try and make it very short when I meet somebody who's wearing a nice. I meet some guy in the airport wearing a Rolex, and I'll go up and say, "Hey, what are you into watches?" But I really appreciate it. It's fun to tell it, and I really have loved the community that I've gotten to know, and I've actually I've kept in really close contact with many of the folks in the industry because they're just such good people, and it's fun. Like I said, you guys are all quirky, but it's quirky in a fun way. But again, I think the point here is that my story is unique, of course, but we can all kind of create our own versions of it, even if it's just intimately in our families. And maybe everybody does this, but I hope that's what people realize is that these things are super precious, and passing them along in a meaningful way is so cool. And who knows what will happen? I mean, Paul wasn't around to see what happened, and I doubt he consciously knew what he was doing at the time. But even giving a watch to to somebody in your family, I mean, who knows what's going to happen? Oh, my granddad gave me this cool Panerai or whatever the hell it is. It's just super cool. And as you mentioned, also the economics of quality is so important. I think that the amount of work that goes into making these things is so special. It's such an example of what's possible that for me, it is a good metaphor for climate and everything. Look what we can do. We can make these incredible complications, and we also can go out and solve these complex problems. So thank you so much. I so appreciate your time, and anybody who listens who wants to get involved in anything or suggest anything, you can find me through that.
We'll link
website.
everything
It's
up.
not, it's not an amazing website. I try and keep up. There's many, many, many more projects that we don't feature. We try and feature the ones that need some help and some leverage. Yeah.
Awesome. Well, James, thank you so much.
We've had some pretty special and wild sort of stories on this podcast. We've had the pleasure of chatting to some great people, but I don't think we've spoken to anyone that has been as close to a story that has had such a broad significance on the world that I live in the world that we built a podcast around.
It was actually incredible to hear that and to chat to James, and I'm going to throw it out there, the word magical. Like, it was just one of those.
I didn't want him to stop talking, and it was just all gold.
Yeah, I'm speechless.
It's a watch. It's a celebrity. It's partially him. Like he's a good storyteller. So
yeah,
that was really special, and I think it's nice to have been a part of that.
We can't follow up, so we're going to end the show. Thank you to Major Tom Media for producing and supporting the podcast, and thank you to our sponsors. If you want to get in touch with us with your own cool watch story or some advice, at otthepodcast@gmail. Felix, our Instagram is
at ot.podcast.
Correct.
Thanks,
and follow us independently.
One more thing. Thank you, James Cox.
Thank you. Well, yeah, he's getting a big thank you. Awesome. Well, we'll catch you guys next week.